This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
It's a real treat to be here at the Mondavi Center, and I'm glad that you came to listen to us talk before what promises to be a memorable concert. Philip Glass and I have been friends and colleagues for some 30 years now, and we've talked about many, many different kinds of music. I remember when he wrote his first opera for full opera chorus and orchestra and everything like that, and when he was doing his first films. And yet, tonight we're sort of going back to the beginning. We're doing some very new work. Our Glass and Wendy Sutter will be doing some very new work. But after the films, after the operas, after the wide variety of material that Philip Glass has written, recently he's started to write a great deal of chamber music again, which has always been part of his work, but it's also really going back, I would say, to some extent to the very, very simplicity, very essence of music, because I would assume the first instrument you probably learned how to write on was probably the piano.
The flute, actually.
The flute, that's right.
But the piano was became my main instrument.
So there's been this flowering of chamber music that you've written in the last few years.
Well, you know, that comes about in a curious way. One of the things that, of course, you know, many people might know, is that very early on I got interested in what we now call global music, but we used to call world music in the old days, but now it's global music. Is that more PC than?
I don't know.
Anyway, that's
they
what
both
we call
fit.
it. So, but I began this in the mid-'60s as a associate of Ravi Shankar's. I was his assistant, but actually I was actually his student, but I was working as his assistant. I was learning from him. And from that, and that was in 1963 or 64, so that's more than 40 years ago. So from that moment on, I began looking and kind of participating and engaging and encountering musicians from other traditions. And that would have been people like Fode Suso from West Africa, Wu Man from China, Mark Atkins from Australia, Ashley McIsaac, Cape Breton fiddle player, all kinds of Tibetan musicians and other African musicians. And that became mixed in with what I did. And part of the progress of my music, such that, as it were, had to do with these encounters and what they brought to it. And so in a certain way, that became folded into the general way that I was working. Very recently, I began, I was playing with a group called Bang on the Can. I was on tour with them maybe 4 years ago. And Wendy Sutter was the cellist in that group. And about a year later, I had the idea of, I was asked to do a piece, and I had the idea of working with cello and voice. Lisa Bialava was the voice, who was a regular singer with me. And Wendy was interested in that. And I began working with her on a piece, which we're going to hear tonight, the Songs and Poems, which is actually, it's barely 2 years old at this point. Now, one of the things that I discovered in my encounters with world music, I came to the conclusion that all music was actually ethnic music. In the way you say all politics is local, all music is local. All music is ethnic music. And when I began working with her, and now I knew a lot about chamber music as a kid, but in the course of my music development, I became involved with what people call experimental music and this global music thing. And then at that point, I was now encountering a person who was steeped deeply in the world of chamber music. She played with Bang on the Can, which is also a lot of progressive music, but besides that, she had toured with Bresnikov with a piece called Suite of Dances, which was which was from the Bach suites. She played with the Orpheus group and with the chamber music of Europe. She played a lot of chamber music, was at Marlborough, so she was really steeped in chamber music. And this was the music that I knew as a boy. I knew it through my father, who loved this music. And now here I was, some 50 years later, listening to this music again. I would, sometimes these pieces, the pieces I was doing were for her, were being played at music festivals like at the Telluride Festival or in one in Aspen. And I was meeting other musicians who were also, like her, really out of the world of classical music. And
as it was understood.
Yeah. But I looked upon them as being a form of ethnic music. I didn't think of it as classical music. Well, to me, it's part of the great quilt, of the great panorama of music. It was just part of it, no more, no less. And I saw it that way. But the point is that I saw it as being important. And I thought that this was something that I could work with. So I wrote these pieces for her. The next thing, I found myself writing music for piano four hands, or two piano four hands for Dennis Davies. Again, I was addressing a classical ensemble. And then shortly after that, Maria Bachmann, a very fine violinist, asked me for a piece, and I wrote her a piece. And then she said, well, what do you think it is? And I thought, well, let's call it, I had different names for it. And I finally said, you know, Maria, it's actually a violin piano sonata. That's what it is. So let's just call it that. And in a way, when I wrote that piece for her, I was recalling, not that it sounded like that, but I was thinking of the tradition I was thinking of the Brahms violin piano sonata, I was thinking of the Fauré sonatas, the Franck sonata, Prokofiev, and then the Beethoven, Mozart. I was thinking, when I was thinking of the piece that I was doing, I said, what does this piece have to do with? And I said, well, it's part of a tradition. It doesn't mean it has to sound like that, but in many ways, because of the way it's not an amplified piece. It's meant to be done as a chamber music piece, and will probably be done that way. I doubt that it will ever be amplified. So I began. I wrote it in that one's in 3 movements. So it's a kind of a classic violin piano sonata. And then I said to someone who I was working with, I said, you know, I've discovered a new frontier. And they said, what? I said, it's the audiences and the performers of what we call classical music, which is actually just concert music. Classical music refers to a period of music, and we use the term loosely to mean these traditions, classic, the classical, the romantic, and the late romantic period. We put them all together and we call it classical music. But I said the new frontier for me is actually classical music. Now the thing is, I come to it. First of all, I had a complete formation of training from. Besides, I was at Peabody when I was a kid in Baltimore, and then I was at Juilliard, and then
Persicati and
all this,
yeah.
And then with Boulanger, who basically studying with her was like having a brain transplant. She worked so hard at the principles of harmony and counterpoint that it was just like having it installed into your brain. And I spent 30 years trying to forget about it.
That's one of the reasons you wrote music in similar motion, wasn't it?
I was.
Sort of, to break the rules?
Yes, but the fact of the matter is, to break the rules so rigorously is actually to follow them unfailingly.
Right.
I just turned black into white, that's all I did. But I didn't do all the other things I could have done, which I eventually began doing. But my first encounters with after my bout of classical, well, let's call it Central European art music, which is what she taught. After a long bout, almost 2 to 3 years with her, I began to write music that was the opposite. But of course, being the opposite, of course, is being the same.
Do we know if she ever heard any of your mature music? And what her response was? She lived till 79.
Yeah,
so
that's right. And I studied with her. My studies ended with her in 65, I believe. It was 63, 64, 65. Then but by 71, I was playing in Paris again.
Yeah.
Now, when I played in Paris, I would go to I would peek around the corner to see if she was there. And if she was there, she would be sitting in the center of the first row. I knew her, that's what she did. And of course, I was terrified that she would be there. And I escaped. I never saw her then. But then a friend of mine later, sometime later, by 76, where she was still, said, asked her if she had heard Einstein on the beach. And she said very enigmatically, yes, I know it. But I don't know whether she, I don't know what she meant by that. It could have been, she might have heard it, she might have seen the score. I doubt she saw the score. She might have heard about it, she might have heard a recording. And she made no comment about it. She said, yes, I know it.
Okay.
But did she make any comment? No, she didn't. Not to me directly. There's another story about my, years later, I came across some letters that she wrote to the Fulbright. I had a Fulbright. And I really thought that the degree to which she absolutely tortured me, to the limits of my mental endurance and mental stability, actually, that I thought that she must have really detested me and thought I was a really hopeless case. And then years later, about 40 years later, I came across some letters that were offered to me that she had written to the Fulbright Commission. She tried to get me a renewal, which they didn't give renewals in Paris. I stayed anyway, but she tried to get, and she was writing letters on my behalf.
Wow.
But now come to think of it, she may have thought that she hadn't really finished with me yet, and that she needed to get me back. So it might, I don't know that those complimentary letters were actually what they appeared to be. So I never, to this day, I don't know.
You wrote those pieces in the 1970s when you were coming into your own, you were inventing your own musical language, and you called them Another Look at Harmony, and you wrote another part 1, part 2, part 3. So these are kind of another look at classical music, as it were.
Oh, you can say that. But on the other hand, I have less ideological problems about music than I never really did. But except in a certain way, when I was writing in a radical musical language, which was people used to call it minimalism. I don't even know if it's still called that in a way, but it doesn't sound so much like that anymore. But I think that taking those extreme positions in terms of music was an ideological way of reacting to the music situation of the time, which I had a lot of good reasons for that. I don't really need to go into it now, but I certainly was thinking that way, and I would say that I'm thinking far less like that now. I think very little. In fact, now when I'm writing music, the analytic part of writing has almost disappeared, fortunately, so that I often don't know the names I don't know the names of the chords. And if someone said, this is it, what key is it? And I would have to look at it and I would have to decide. When I'm not writing, I'm not thinking that, but with the early music, I was thinking that way.
It's funny because earlier today we were talking about the early days with the Philip Glass Ensemble and how it would just be one car and then a van loaded up with equipment. And now you're playing, I mean, we have some other instruments here tonight, but now often you're playing just piano and cello. That would have made things a whole lot easier getting around the country in those days.
Well, Wendy Sutter would have been about 6 years old at the time. So that would have been difficult. But we learned, when I say we, I mean the ensemble. And tonight, Mick Rossi plays with me and regularly with the ensemble. Yeah. Dan Dryden, who is helping with the sound, is a regular member of the ensemble. My tour manager, Jim Woodard has also been with me for, these are regular members of the ensemble. Mm-hmm. The ensemble still exists as a
group. I know that.
But this is kind of an offshoot of it. And I also do solo piano music. I'll be doing a solo piano concert in Napa in the town tomorrow, day after tomorrow. But the piano isn't, though I played a lot with electronic instruments, the piano is actually the instrument I have at home. I often begin the day and end the day with the piano, so it's not so strange for me to write for the piano. My approach to music as I get older tends to be much more inclusive and less ideological.
Tell us something about the pieces we're going to be listening to tonight.
We're starting, I'll start with two pieces from a group of works that were done in the late 70s called Metamorphosis are actually associated with the first film I did with Earl Morris called A Thin Blue Line. They come from that period. I'll do two of those pieces, and then we're going to do, I would say, Wendy Sutter will be playing an extended suite of pieces, seven movements for solo cello. It's called Songs and Poems for solo cello. I'm not really, I don't know where titles come from. In fact, and when I do know, I usually forget after a while. There may have been a reason for that, but I just saw, she asked me at one point, what I had originally written it for Lisa and for Wendy, and then Wendy said, well, I'd like a solo piece, but it's a little awkward having to do with, to find a singer every time I want to do it. And I said, you're right. Let me just rewrite the piece. So I went and I took that original piece and I composed new sections and I redid the ones, and I said that we turned it into a solo piece. There's 7 movements. The first and second are very close together, so you might miss that there's a second movement there. But after that, you can follow them pretty easily. They've been compared, the instrument itself that's just playing is a cello that's 400 years old. This is a very interesting phenomenon. This, I've only heard the piece played on that instrument. And it's an instrument this instrument was built before Bach wrote the Bach suites.
Wow.
It was built 60 years before that. It was actually originally viola da gamba that was extended. It was built by Amati. It was extended and then finished by Stradivarius. It then went into the Vatican for 200 years and kind of disappeared, but it acquired some beautiful painting on it. You might have seen that. There are angels on the back, and there's a papal crown on the actual back of the cello. What's interesting about the piece is that these pieces, and something that we wonder, we discuss at how kind of an instrument acquires such a strong personality. Where does that come from? And this piece, this instrument is made for modern music. It has to have to wait 400 years. I wait a long time. But it sounds quite good with the Baroque too. But this piece works extremely well with modern pieces. Now, there are a lot of theories about this. And the one that's widely believed and held by musicians is that the actual vibration of the music has an effect on the wood and turns the instrument into a coherent voice in some. And I'm not sure that this is. I don't know whether we're talking about physics now or about some kind of subjective idea about what some kind of. I have no idea. I can't discount the fact that it may actually be like that. The fact that the resonance of the instrument is so profound, and so in a way, when you hear this piece, you're hearing 3 things. You're hearing an instrument, and in a way, the music was written for. You're hearing a player who understands that literature extremely well, and also knows modern music very well. And you hear an instrument that was made for another period of music. Practically, it was played in church services at the Vatican for 200 years, and then when it was left it went into a private collection for 150 years. It was owned by a woman named Harriet Curtis, who we think was probably connected to the Curtis School in Philadelphia. She was from Pennsylvania. Wendy also was trained at the Curtis School. I mean, you get into all kinds of funny things when you start thinking about this stuff. So, and then I wrote the piece for her and for the cello. And so you almost can say that the presentation of the music at that moment is a coincidence of three streams of energy: the energy of her life, the energy of the life of the cello, and the energy of my life. And they come together in this piece. Or let me put it another way. If any of these elements were different, you would not be hearing that piece tonight.
That's really remarkable, because we often think of composers writing specifically for certain performers, but you're actually writing for a certain performer and a certain instrument, which is pretty unusual.
It's unmistakable. For me, it's an unmistakable fact, and I believe it is for Wendy also. But I can leave that. Now, we've only recently, she has just found the best bow. Now, all bows are different, but she just recently found a wonderful bow for this instrument. So now the whole package is complete. Anyway, so that's the second piece, and that goes on for half an hour. So I'm going to do I believe I do two short pieces there. And that's when Mick Rossi, who was the percussionist, these will be two, these are two etudes if I got the order of the program right. Number 2 and then number 10, and he plays number 10, and he'll be playing hand drums with that. After that, we play 4 pieces that come from the film Nakoi Kasi. Now, this is fairly recent. Now, we can say the Songs and Poems was from maybe 2007, but Nakoi Kasi was from 2001. These are little interludes and, for a film made by Alfred Reggio, the man that made Kaionis Kasi and Poa Kasi. And these little interludes were written for cello, and they were recorded originally for the film, and Yo-Yo Ma did the original recording, but he only spent a day with them. We have been performing them, and they've now become a place of their own, in a way. So now after that, the last group of pieces we do would be, is a group from a piece called The Screens, which is a play by Genet. It was written, I saw the first performance, it was written in 1965 at the Théâtre Dion in Paris. It was called Les Paravents, if you would maybe know by it's not done very much. It's a story about the French occupation of Algiers at the time. And it was a very political piece at the time. And when I was asked to do the music for it, it was directed by Joanna Coladas at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. And I had seen it in Paris, as she had. We had seen it at the not the first performance, but at the first series of performances. It was such a scandalous piece at the time that there were riots in the front of the theater, but there were police riots. They tried to stop the performances. It was a very radical piece in its day. I decided that for the purposes of that, I would ask an African musician, and it was Fode Suso from the Gambia. I mentioned him a little earlier. He's a kora player and a singer. And together we alternated writing sections of the piece so that there would be a European part and there would be the French part and there would be the African part. And we did some things together and some things separately. I picked 3 pieces for tonight's. One was, it begins with a piece called The Orchard. These pieces have such beautiful titles, and unfortunately I don't remember anything about the play anymore, so I don't remember why it's called The Orchard, but it feels like that to me. So that's for Wendy, myself, and Mick. The second one is called France, and the third one is called The French Lieutenant. And these are very sentimental pieces. Genet was accused of hating the French, but he himself, of course, was French. And if he hated the French, it was a complicated affair, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. When I wrote these pieces, I thought of them, I imagined the French lieutenant in a cafe in Algiers. It's raining, it's lonely. He feels terribly sorry for himself, and this is the music for himself, so that's what it is. So it's very sentimental music in a certain way, and yet they're true portraits. They're portraits of a theater conception that way. We end, I think the last piece on the program is from Glassworks. Is called Closing. And again, it's with Mick, and it's a short piece, but it's with Mick and Wendy and myself. So that's the program.
Remarkable. I know there are a lot of musicians out there who would very much like to play your music. And you've been reluctant to let a lot of it out in scores, because I think you still have the same attitude that you had 30 years ago, which is that in general, if people want your music, you want to bring it to them.
Well, let's put it more bluntly. I make my living by playing. So I'm not inclined to give away the music that I just don't want to do it. Now, it does happen. The symphonies are played by symphony orchestras.
Right.
The string quartets are getting played quite widely now. But they were mostly written for the Kronos Quartet. But the ensemble music and this music is the use of it. The music that I am out playing, and that the solo piano music, the etudes for piano, these pieces, I've reserved them for my own purposes. And it's a little difficult sometimes, but it's not for me really. But people would like to play them, but I feel, well, maybe 10, 15 years at the most, I can play them a little bit longer. I mean, if I'm lucky. And if people want to play them after that, I don't care. I won't be around anyway, so what do I care?
I hope you'll be around a long time.
Thank you, Tim. but still, as long as I can play them, and it's a narrow point of view, and yet the economics of my life don't allow me to be careless about these things. I don't make my living doing anything but playing and writing.
Do you think eventually that there'll be some kind of like ye olde piano book which will gather together all this material?
I would. There are 16 piano etudes, which I would eventually they'll be edited and published.
And a lot of organ music too, which I think
organ music too. Some of them I've published a couple of those. There are four or five of those, and before I had made up my mind thoroughly on this matter, I had published a handful of pieces, but I stopped. I stopped printing them. No. Though the quartets and the symphonies and the operas are around. But Michael Reisman, my regular music director, has made a number of piano arrangements from the films.
Satyagraha.
And has done whole books of music. But I'm still the publisher of that. And he agrees with me. He has done those arrangements for himself to do concerts, and he does do concerts, and they're not available for other people. So it's just, that's the way it is.
This year, or rather last year, last April, was the year that your music was finally brought into the Metropolitan Opera. Now, you had done Einstein on the Beach there in 1976.
It was a special event.
That was a very special event.
But it was co-produced by the Met.
That's right. That's right. Jane Herman, I think.
Yeah, that's right. She produced it, but it wasn't commissioned by the Met, and it wasn't in the regular season.
How did it feel to be embraced by this sort of cathedral of opera in the United States?
Don't forget the Voyage was done in '92.
That's true.
But the point, but I think the interesting point was that by the time I got around to doing the Voyage in '92, I'd probably written 15 operas anyway. So I wasn't new at the game. With Satyagraha, I was quite new, and it was a very radical piece in many ways, and only a handful of opera companies would touch it. So, and even, I remember talking to Jane Herman at the time she was connected with, and they said, how do you get an opera at the Met? She said, look, the Met will be the last place that will play your work. When everyone else is doing it, then they'll do it. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but it did make its way around to some smaller opera companies. And I think the coincidence of the theme of changes in society through nonviolence. I think that idea, which is the idea of the piece, the time had come for it in a different way. I don't really know why Peter Gelb asked to do it. No, actually, that's wrong. The English National Opera did the first production, and Peter Gelb participated as a co-producer, but it was actually done in London first. I'm not sure why they got the idea, but it turned out, and the text is in Sanskrit, and it's the Bhagavad Gita, which is not something that people grew up knowing in this country. And yet, the interesting thing, Tim, was that when we projected the words in English to go, well, we didn't use the little subtitle thing that they have. We had the words in the set, and when I saw the words of the Bhagavad Gita on the screen at the Metropolitan Opera House, and I looked around, to the people that were in the audience, the words didn't seem strange. The themes of nonviolence and change were there, and they were there for everyone to see. That they had been born in India thousands of years ago, or written at that time. it's a coincidence that no one bothered to pay much attention to. It was, the theme was familiar. In a world of such violence that we live in, to have it just an evening of 3 or 4 hours where we thought about something different, it was a kind of, it's a kind of an optional vacation you can take from what the world that we truly live in. I'm not sure that that art changes the world, or that, I don't know that it can do that. I don't know that the spirit of any age has been so free of violence that they could hope to take that up. We've been great failures at that, and not just Gandhi, but King also was a great proponent of that. I no longer think that I'm changing the world by that, but I do think that that the hours that just to think about it, to contemplate it, and that was always my original idea. I said, let's just think about this for a few hours. Just think about it and see what changes that can make to us in a personal way.
Well, it's a remarkable and beautiful piece, and it was extraordinary to see it and hear it performed after so long, working with you all those years ago on preparing.
You want to admit that what you were doing?
Oh, yeah. I'll admit it. It was my first musical job. I worked as a copyist and editor for Philip when he was putting together the Satyagraha in the summer of 1980.
I had 3 or 4 fellows in my apartment.
Yeah.
No air conditioning in those days.
No air conditioning. I remember it vividly. A very hot, very sticky summer in New York. What are you working on now? What plans do you have? You're working on, I assume you have to be working on at least one opera.
Yeah, there is. It's a very interesting opera, which about the astronomer Kepler. Now, I've long been, as you know, I've been very drawn to figures in science. There was, of course, Einstein. There's Galileo. I did a score for a film about Stephen Hawking called Brief History of Time. And so now the Kepler. I have my personal take on scientists, and it comes from the fact that as a child even, I would say that music was my love, but my hobby was science. Even as by the age of 10 or 12, I belonged to an astronomy club in Baltimore where we made telescopes and we looked at the stars. On the top floor, on the roof of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, the name of the library, Enoch Pratt, you know that library.
Oh, I know it.
And the astronomy club was, and I would go there as a child, and I was making, looking at, learn how to make telescopes and do that. And then later, about the same time actually, in 49 and 50, right after the Second World War and the first atomic bomb, and suddenly Einstein and the theory of relativity was, everybody wanted to know about it. And there are all kinds of popular books about it. And even Einstein wrote a popular book about it. And I learned from that, that Einstein was a dreamer. And he explained once the most wonderful thing that I saw. He explained in his own words how someone said, well, where did you get the idea for the theory of relativity? He said, well, I imagine myself sitting on a beam of light, and the beam of light is traveling through the universe, and I asked myself, what would I see? And then I began to develop the mathematics to explain what I saw, and that was the theory of relativity. So he was a dreamer. He was and then I thought the same thing of Kepler, and the same thing of, I think, I talked to Brian Greene, who's involved with string theory. He's a young guy, and we're talking about doing a piece together, by the way. But to me, scientists are like poets. And so by treating them, by bringing them into opera houses, what I'm doing is combining them and wrapping them into music. Kepler was a very interesting guy. He was first he was a very mean guy. He had a enemies list of all his friends in high school and why he hated them, and why they hated him. He was just a person you just didn't want to know.
When did he live exactly?
Well, he was just before. He was old. He was old enough to have known the young Galileo, or to have been writing to him. He wanted a hand at the telescope, and Galileo refused, actually. So it said. So we're talking the 16th century. At the same time, and this is what I I've become interested in these kinds of people. The kinds of people that are both, they're both sinners and saints, but the feet in the mud and the head in the clouds. And he was definitely one of those guys, like the kind of guy you just probably didn't want to have anything to do with. But he would be teaching arithmetic in the grade schools in Linz, Austria. By the way, Linz, Austria commissioned the piece. And to kind of snotty-nosed kids that had no idea what he was talking about. He was just talking about arithmetic. And while he was doing that, he was simultaneously thinking about the movement of his great accomplishment was he defined the ellipse as the movement of the planets around the sun. Now, two things about that. One thing, that they were moving around the sun, which he never admitted publicly.
Because it would have gotten him in trouble.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Galileo he spent his last years in house arrest because of that. But he somehow did it without saying that it was going around the sun. But so it was that, but that at the same time, it was not a perfect circle, which it should have been. It should have been a perfect circle, but the trouble was that it was an ellipse. And the arithmetic and the mathematics pointed to the ellipse, and he finally had to say, okay, that's what it is. But for a man of that time to come to that, this is a tremendous intellectual accomplishment, but also the stamina to live by his ideas. At the same time, he had a whole bunch of other crackpot ideas about the harmony of the spheres. Now, I'm saying the crackpot ideas. We've all loved this idea, but the planets were associated with triangles and squares and pentagon and hexagons, and then they all supposed to fit into each other. So there's a whole side of Kepler which is completely bonkers. I mean, by scientific standards, but yet, from the side of the dreamer and the poet.
Like alchemy.
Well, a funny thing about alchemy, he by luck, I think, but I don't know, maybe it wasn't luck. He managed to predict the invasion of the Turks across, the incursion of the Turks across the Austrian border, the place and the date. And he informed the government of that, and they put an army and had them waiting there. And by God, the Turks showed up, and they repulsed them. His living was made for life. Like he did it through astrology, or so he says. Or maybe it was who knows? At any rate, he had an astrological chart that predicted that, and from that moment on, he could make his living doing charts, which he hated. He hated doing it, but that's how he made his living. That was his cab driving in those days. But anyway, so he was a very interesting character. I'm now interested in another very interesting character. Who was, I don't know if it's so different. I'm talking with a writer who did a book about Walt Disney. It's called The Perfect American. And it's actually about the death of Disney. Now, Disney is another one of these guys, feet in the mud, head in the clouds guy. I mean, he's responsible for a global fantasy that I would say there's probably, and he himself said, his greatest, Walt Disney said, my greatest invention was Walt Disney. That everybody knows about this. And at the same time, he was an extremely difficult person.
Oh, yeah.
Women were not allowed to work except in secretarial jobs. In fact, the writer of that book, a guy named Peter Jung, just sent me he got a copy of a letter that the Disney company sent to a woman who had applied for a job as a cartoonist, and they basically said, we don't hire women to do cartoons. I mean, so there's that. He was also very proud of the fact that African Americans never worked there except that they were allowed to cut grass. The Jewish community was not invited to work there, although in fact they ended up working there quite a lot. So he was he was from Missouri, from a small town in southern Missouri, basically from the South. And he lived by these ideas. At the same time, he was a man, and the people that worked for him said that without him they couldn't have done that. He didn't do the drawing. Oh, he did some early ones, but the actual drawings were done by other people. And they would say, well, we couldn't have done the work without him. He pushed them to a level of accomplishment that they said they were not capable of doing. So this is a very interesting character.
Now, the Disney estate is notoriously litigious. Is there going to be problems if you make him into an opera
I don't think so. I think we have a. I think there's some protection when we deal with public figures. As a journalist, you were a journalist once. You're not any longer.
I was.
But we're allowed to write about. We're not talking about.
Recreating Mickey Mouse or
no,
doing
we're not
something
doing that. No, we're talking about more ineffable things than that, things that are harder to pin down, about character, about things like that. I mean, we're allowed to make fun of people. We can make fun of our presidents, and we often do. Saturday Night Live have been shut down in any other country, so wouldn't have been allowed to do the things they've done. One of the great things that we have in this country is we've pushed the free speech idea. We're on both, as Americans, we're on both sides of the question. In fact, free speech is enshrined in the Constitution. As is separation of church and state, all these ideas which we live by and swear by, but we also snipe at them too, as a country. But we're actually secretly hoping that they will. Of course, surely they must know that to take us to court for writing an opera would be a great success. So, well, we're secretly hoping that will happen, but I don't think they're quite. Well, I don't know.
Well, they just managed to extend the copyright rule pretty much entirely for Disney.
But not just for Disney. In fact, every person involved with intellectual property has to thank the Disney company because the protections that were awarded to them have been awarded to all of us. My compositions are protected for 75 years after I died, much longer than they need be.
Irving Berlin actually outlived his copyrights, the way the copyright law was then.
It
drove him utterly crazy. He lived, in the old days, it used to be 75 years, period, from when it was first copyrighted till when it went out of copyright. And he outlived Alexander's Ragtime Band. And for what I'm told by people who are close to the 100-year-old Irving Berlin, he was just as angry as could be whenever this was brought up.
But eventually that was changed to be after the death of the writer.
Yeah, but that was after the death of Irving Berlin.
Yeah, yes, that's right. But now it's after the death of our grandchildren, practically. Well, I think that's stretching it. Or after our great-grandchildren. I mean, what the...
Well, we want to open up the floor to you now to have any questions that you'd like to ask Philip Glass. So would anyone like to start? Yes, please. The question was the first experience was with your music with Twyla Tharp in the upper room, and what was it like to see your work danced?
From my first years at Juilliard, I was writing music for dance. I was maybe 19 or 20 years old at the time. And I asked myself a very simple question. Who wants my music? Who would I show? And I thought, well, dancers like music and theater companies like music. So I began writing for dance companies and theater companies. Now, we had several dance companies at Juilliard at the time. The José Limón Company was there, and so was the Martha Graham Company. But I wasn't writing for José Limón and Martha Graham, though I met José Limón at the time, and I did meet Martha Graham eventually, but I wasn't writing for them. I was writing for their students. And I found that dance students, young choreographers, wanted music. So I wrote music for them. So from my earliest collaborators were dance people, and they have continued to be up to the present. I am probably the most danced to living composer. I mean, it's really all over the place. And not just the dance, and I've done about 20 ballets anyway, but apart from that, other pieces have been pressed into the service of the dance world, which I've been delighted by. Now, I got very interested in dance, and I think, actually, I spent so much time with dance companies that I even formed the idea that, of course, I was way past able to do this, but I formed the idea that I wish I had become a dancer, because I thought it was so interesting. The human body is our quintessential experience, and to make art out of our physical presence to me is an ultimate form of art. Of course, I was, by the time I was working with, at 19 or 20 I might have, but I toured with my first dance company with Twyla Tharp, with Lucinda Charles in 1979. By that time I was 42 years old. However, I discovered that there was a dance class every day in the lobby of the theater, whatever theater we were at, and Lucinda traveled with a ballet mistress so I got permission to take the class. So I actually got to take dance class. I was 42. It was pathetic, actually, but the dancers were thrilled that I was there, and I did okay until we got into these what they call combinations. You know about that. It started, and that kind of memory. I have very good musical memory, but that kind of body memory I didn't have at all. So I got very involved with dance, and later I was working with Twyla Tharp and other companies. And from that, when I was working with Twyla, for example, I said, let me come and see the company. And I always did this. I would go and sit with the company and watch them for a while before I even wrote music for them. And I don't know exactly what I was doing. I just wanted to have a visual and personal response to who they were. Again, in theater, I became a theater composer almost primarily. Working in theater and opera and film, I consider that a form of theater of a kind. And then what I would do when I was working at the public theater, I would go to the rehearsals, I would go to the costume fittings, I would sit through lighting rehearsals. I really wanted to know how theater was made. And in the end, I ended up having, I didn't master any of the arts, so the only one I really could do well was music. But I understood how it worked. I understood how long it took someone to leave. So when I write an opera now, I know how long it takes to get people on and off stage. And for example, I'm doing a piece in Lynn, so it's a rather small stage. So going on and off doesn't take very long. So the transitions will be shorter. However, if the opera goes to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which it will go, the stage is about 50% bigger. So I also have to have music that can be made larger so that when they, so these are the kinds of things that you learn. Working with a dance company, and I performed with Lucinda's company. We went on several tours with them. I discovered that when we went to a theater, I had to change the tempo of the music to fit the stage. When the stage was bigger, the music had to be a little bit slower. When it was faster, when the stage was smaller, the music was faster. And the conductor, that would be Michael Reisman, had to take that into account. When you go to a stage, what will happen is that the choreographer will place the piece, and it may take an hour or so, and figure out how there'll be a kind of a rehearsal of the piece to fit the stage, and my music director has to be there. And if he makes a mistake, he gets a dressing down from the dancers. Unlike you can't believe they could get so angry if he made a mistake, and he didn't make many mistakes. I remember he made early on. He was doing something so quickly that two dancers almost collided, and they were really angry.
I'll bet.
But that's how you learn about these things.
The question is, when Mr. Glass writes music for film, how does he approach it in a way rather than, say, writing music for just a regular concert?
One of the basic things that a composer has to learn, and they rarely learn it until they're faced with the practicalities of it, is that the workplace of the theater, of a concert hall, of an opera house, and a film, the workplaces are different. The opera house belongs to the composer. When I'm asked to do an opera, I get to pick the director, and the director and I will pick the designer. But after that, the designer picks the lighting designer, and the lighting, and the director and the lighting designer will pick the costume designer. I am also allowed to pick the writer. So I get to pick the writer and the director. So that's the main thing. Now, when I say I get to do that, now that's the only place I get to do that. So the opera house belongs to the composer. That's why I write so many operas. Because I'm not done yet, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, the dance house belongs to the choreographer, and I can tell you stories that it's absolutely without any question. That they apportion the rehearsal time according to their needs, and if you're lucky, you'll get some time with the orchestra, and not very much. The theater belongs to the theater director. They'll cut and trim as they like. Now, film, there's independent films where you can collaborate. The difficulty with industry films is that it's a collaborative art film which is set up in a non-collaborative way. So it's extremely frustrating and difficult, and anyone will tell you that. And the people that run it will tell you that themselves. You know, I've done maybe 20 or 30 films. I can be working with someone who's making their first film, and they'll tell me how I'm supposed to write the music. What do you think of that? But that's the reality. On the other hand, I found, the last thing I'll go on, the last thing I've discovered, and this is probably true for every business and every profession, the more experienced and more secure the director or the person who is running it is, the more freedom you have to work with them. The more insecure they are, the more they tell you what to do. So, human nature.
Yes, sir. The gentleman is a great fan of Glass's score for Dracula and wondered how the project came about.
The film was owned by is now owned by MGM. I don't know what they're called now, but at the time it was MGM. And they decided to reissue 3 of the old, right at the turn of the talkies, you know, when the first spoken films came out. And the 3 was The Mummy, Frankenstein, and Dracula. And they wanted to, none of them had film scores. Dracula had they played Swan Lake at the opening credits, that was it. So they asked me if I would do a score for it, and they said, pick one of the 3, and I said, I'll do all 3. Of course, that's what I would do. And they said, no, you have to pick one. And they said, but, I said, if you let me do Frankenstein, I'll do it with chorus and organ. And I had another idea I forget it was, but I had ideas for all 3. But they said, no, pick one. And then I had this image of Bela Lugosi's face. That took up the whole screen. I said, had to be Dracula. The other thing is it had been a play. It had been filmed as a play. It was clearly that it was. It's also very clear that they ran out of money before the film was quite finished. And if you look at the film carefully, you'll see that the last 3 minutes of the film go. They had to get through the story right at the end. So what I did, I used the music to. There were very awkward scene changes. I did the music to tie together the pieces, and also I brought the overture back at the end to make the ending a little more acceptable. So I was able actually to take things that were problems in the film, real problems, that had to do with the economics and the time. I bet that the film was shot in 2 weeks, I'm sure, and probably edited in 5 days. It was done very, very quickly. The company that did it was traveling in London for about 18 months. It was a Hungarian theater company, and Bela Lugosi was playing Dracula. That was the company they filmed. Well, it does take...
The question is about the technical side of Mr. Glass's music, especially music in 12 parts, which was performed on Monday night in San Francisco. I wonder if any of you went to that. And about how difficult it would be for a piece that lasts just about 4 hours.
Yeah, well, first of all, any new musical language will inevitably have a performance style to go with it. If you think about it, it can't be any other way. For it to be truly new, there has to be a new way to play it. That means that there's a different technique of playing. With my ensemble that began in around 67 and 68, we spent, I would say, 3 or 4 years learning how to play very unforgiving music. The eighth notes have to be lined up exactly right. And what we discovered, we were playing with synthesizers because we had multiple keyboards, and we discovered that the touch was very different from a piano. We developed a very light touch. When I'm playing, it's almost like a feather touch on the keyboard, and I can do that for hours. Basically, we taught ourselves how to play that music. Now, having said that, there's another element of stamina that has to do with the emotional stamina of focusing and being involved with a piece for 4 hours. the singer has to take a break. She doesn't sing during part 10, but she sings all the way through. And the day before, she won't talk to anybody. She doesn't use her voice at all. And we can't do it 2 days in a row. Absolutely out of the question. Basically, we developed a performance technique that has to do with playing. The wind players, a lot of them do circular breathing. And they've actually, they're the ones that are the most, I would think, compromised physically by the experience. And the wind players are the hardest, they have the hardest part. And I can hear it on my monitor. I'm astonished by how they take a break when they need to, but I'm astonished by how few breaks they actually take.
The question was how to put together a concert, whether you bunch specific kind of music together, where you give it sort of a beginning, middle, and an end like a term paper. I hope I'm doing justice to you. How do you imagine a concert?
In fact, the programs change. Even the same pieces, the lineups, the show order, we call it, changes from time to time. I'll usually do one that seems logical to me in terms of who's on stage and who's off stage. So I take something very practical. Okay, I start, then Wendy comes on now. She needs a break because she's played for 30 minutes. So I come back and play again, and then I play with Mick, who hasn't been on stage yet. Now she comes back. So the first way is usually a kind of a choreography in terms of, but then after we've done a program a number of times, I begin to change it. I just start changing the pieces and I change the order. And, I have so much music that I can draw from that I can change the program, and I can do that and still keep a kind of a core idea. For example, the show tonight, a lot of it has to do with songs and poems and the placement. I put it early in the program because you as an audience are prepared to listen attentively earlier. I don't want to get you when you're tired and hit you with a piece like that. So my way of programming is that in this evening, the evening tends to get lighter as it goes on. And I learned that from concerts I went to in India. For years I would go to India to hear music concerts, and I noticed they didn't put their biggest pieces at the end. And I noticed also that when I was writing operas, that the finales don't come at the end of the third act, they come at the end of the second act, the big piece, because that's when the chorus can still sing. If you have them sing at the end of the third act, they're not going to be able to sing very much. So there are physical things like that that you begin to play with. But what I found is that there are these physical limits like stamina and where people are. But apart from that, I'm very interested in this. I tend to make the heavy loaded at the front of the concert, because what I liked about the concerts in India I would go to hear a great singer like Bhimsa Joshi, great singer. He would begin with long ragas that would, and the early parts of the concert could take 30 or 40 minutes for one raga. By the end of the evening, he was singing songs, popular songs. And I said, oh, that's such a good idea. I thought, so I tend to work that way, because by the end of the evening, you've had the big meal, so to speak. And the end of the concert is for the lighter things, I think.
I was thinking how Rossini's first act finales tend to always be the more grand ones than the second acts.
There are endless things to learn from Rossini.
Yes. Very great composer. We are very much agreed on that.
And technically, as a composer, just to learn the tools of the trade.
Yeah.
And he knew everything.
Listen, this has to be it. Thank you so much for being here today. I apologize that we didn't get to all your questions. Thank you.